My bedroom is at the far right of the house. You go down the hallway, then into my room. You'll find a window to your left. The next window is in the wall across from the door, and the last one is right next to my bed, opposite corner of the door. In the pictures I showed the garage from 2 different windows. There's a small area in between the back of the garage and the house, right outside my room. You walk through that and you're in the yard to the right of my room. It would be a pain to try to run from my first window to the third one, because of the garage. About 3 years ago, I was laying in bed at night. I heard a knock on each window. Imagine someone tapping 3 windows, one right after the other. Tap, tap, tap. The third one wasn't even a foot away from me. It was impossible to knock on each window like that. If I tried right now, it would sound like tap, 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 not tap, tap, tap. That terrified me. I slept in the living room that night. Fast forward to 2 years after that, which would be last year. I forgot who it was, but one of my grandmother's neighbors said that someone had knocked on their windows the previous night. A couple weeks after that, someone else said the same thing. My grandmother told us about the knocker, and we all had a good laugh. Well, it calmed down after a while. Then my grandmother told us that it happened to her. There's a sliding glass door that's in her bedroom, which leads to the deck outside. In the middle of the night, she heard someone knocking. Sadly, there's a curtain, and she has trouble getting out of bed sometimes, so she never saw who it was. A while after that happened, it happened to my aunt, who lives on the same street as my grandmother. My aunt was in the bathroom. There's a window at the top of the wall, but much easier to reach. Someone was knocking on it. The knocking stopped after that, although there was one instance of my family knocking on living room windows, and me almost calling the police, but that's a different story. Last week something strange happened. I was laying in bed browsing Reddit, and I heard a very faint tap on my window. Try tapping the tip of your finger on glass. It sounded just like that. I have plants outside in one of my windowsills, and I leave the blinds halfway up 24/7 so they get some sun. I'm now paranoid that the knocker can easily look in and spy on me. This happened when I was about 10 or 11. My mom dropped me off at my friend's house for a sleepover, and it's just my friend and her little brother, maybe like 6 years old. We were just getting to the age where our parents would leave us home alone for a few hours at a time. For context, we're both female. Of course, there were the typical rules like never opening the door to a stranger, keep the door locked, etc. We were educated on stranger danger. However, this day we dropped the ball. I'm at the house for maybe 10 minutes. There's a knock on the door. Why we answered it, I'll never know. It was a middle-aged man, wearing a suit and clean cut. He seemed friendly and immediately said he was working at the construction site down the road, and saw that my mom lost her hubcap. Well, shit, I thought. That sounds legitimate and important. With concern, he asked for my address so he can return it. I tell him without hesitation, and the man seems pleased. With both my friend and I at the door, he then asks if we are home alone. Her brother, being young and unaware, blurts out that their mom went out to get groceries. My friend and I shoot each other a look of understanding and remind her brother that she's home and downstairs. The man's face went from lit up to sullen. He assures me he will drop the hubcap off and leaves. Promptly, I call my mom and tell her what happened. She pauses and then states that her vehicle doesn't have hubcaps. I now realize how stupid I was to give him my address. My mom tells us to ensure all doors are locked, windows, and curtains closed, and to tell my friend's mom as soon as she gets back, and then to call the cops. My friend's mom was super upset and freaked out. From then on, we weren't even allowed to leave the backyard without an adult with us. Nothing ever happened, though. The guy never showed up at my place as far as I know. It was so strange. So sharp-dressed construction man. Let's not meet again. When I was younger, I used to move around a lot. However, I primarily stayed in one county, just going from town to town. One of these places I lived in, though, not very long, was when I was about 10 years old, and I actually lived around things. I could walk to the library, 2 different gas stations, a couple of churches. That was pretty unusual for me. Anyway, it was getting close to summer vacation, and I just had a huge fight with my sister, which wasn't rare by any means, but it was big enough that my aunt, who had been babysitting us at the time, sent me off to go take a walk and cool down. I ended up walking to this fountain in town that was a couple blocks away from where I lived. For a while, I was just walking in circles around the fountain, playing with the water, and taking coins just so I could throw them back in. In all honesty, I was probably a little more alert than I usually would have been, because I was messing around with the coins, which I had definitely been yelled at before for doing, so I was afraid I was going to get in trouble. It was because of this I was even paying attention to the people that were walking past, both near me and on the other side of the street. One man in particular had managed to get my attention the most, primarily because he only had one arm. However, I had manners, so I did my best not to stare, but I was 10. So like any other 10-year-old would probably do, I kept glancing up and kept doing so, thinking he'd leave any moment as he had been just standing there on the other side of the street. Eventually I felt I had cooled off enough that I could go back home. And as I started heading back, the man had begun crossing the street, making a beeline right towards me. It was then my aunt and siblings, and had come walking down the street to get me, calling my name. I started walking faster towards them. The man quickly turned around and started walking another way entirely. Well, I thought that was weird and was eager to get home. I didn't say anything. About a month later, I was staying overnight at a friend's. She was telling me how her dad had a restraining order against one of his old friends for being weird with her. I don't remember the exact phrasing she used, but she went on to tell me his name, which now escapes me, and how he had only one arm. I remember thinking, oh, I think I might have seen him before. I don't really remember how the conversation went after that. It was just a few weeks after that I was staying with my aunt and grandparents in a different town a few miles away. My mom and siblings were halfway across the state, and I hadn't gone because I wanted to spend the summer with my friends. My mom had agreed to it. I'd been playing outside on our front porch. Me and my friend were making semi-trucks honk as it went by, since the road we lived on was close to a highway and a lot passed by. I had been playing outside on our front porch. Eventually we noticed there was a red car that kept going around the block, and like I usually do, I tried not to think too much of it. Maybe they were looking for someone. Anyway, my friend and I ended up walking down to the only gas station in town to get a soda worth her allowance money. When we got there, we noticed the red car we saw earlier was parked there, and we walked past the windows of the gas station to get inside. The way the gas station was situated was so that these diner tables were right next to the window, so people could sit if they wanted. I happened to glance inside for one reason or another, and when I did, the man with one arm was there, sitting at one of the tables. I freaked out and ran home to hide in my room. I wish I had told someone in my family, an adult, about all of these experiences with this man, but my family life was complicated. It wasn't the first time something bad or something that freaked me out had happened and had me scared. But like those other times, I didn't tell anyone but the friend that saw me run away. Anyway, by the next year I was living with my grandmother, who had divorced my grandfather in another state altogether, and haven't seen him since. At the time I was 18, female, smallish, and looked a few years younger than my age. It was the end of my first year of college, and I spent summer break living with my dad. He was usually away for work, but I was in a bad mental health at the time and had developed mild agoraphobia, so being alone all day suited me just fine. I almost never answered the phone or the doorbell, assuming that if it was someone I wanted to talk to, they would let me know they were going to call or visit first. On the day in question, some workers were in our yard, fixing the cable or whatever. I guess something must have made it pretty obvious I was home alone. No cars in the driveway, or me walking past the window, because at about lunchtime, someone started ringing the doorbell, which doesn't sound creepy on its own, but this went on for 45 straight minutes. I ignored the doorbell as was my habit, and they just did not stop. They went through multiple intervals of holding down the doorbell button, and then ringing it several times in quick succession. They then banged loudly on the door repeatedly and tried the handle more than a few times. Once or twice they would stop for several minutes, I think trying to lure me into feeling safe enough to check the door, and then they would start it up again. Whoever was at the door knew I was in there, was determined that I interact with them. In hindsight, the fact that they were trying the door handle repeatedly should have been a sign to call the police. But at that time, I assumed I was just being my usual paranoid self, and that maybe the cable workers had an emergency and needed to talk to my dad about something. I hid in the closet downstairs and texted my dad, telling him to come home because the cable guys needed to talk to him. Unfortunately, my dad worked a 25-minute drive away. During that time, whoever was at the door would not stop. They didn't try the handle anymore. I remember because my dad said to call 911 if they tried it again. But they still kept banging loudly on the door, holding down the doorbell button, and pressing the button as many times as they could. They gave up a few minutes before my dad finally got home. He went out to talk to the cable workers, and when they denied wanting to talk to him, asked if they had noticed anyone at our front door. The cable workers said there had been no one there. They worked in full view of our front door and could not have missed someone standing at our stoop for 45 minutes. This, to me, is the creepiest part. I cannot think of any reason for them to claim ignorance other than one of them being responsible and having intentions they didn't want my dad to know about. My dad worked from home for the rest of the day. The cable workers took a few more days to finish their work, but no one came to the door anymore, thankfully. I'm in a better mental place now than I was back then, but still I make it a habit to never answer the door unless I know who's really there.